Starting off this countdown, we have James Whitey Bulger. James Joseph Bulger Jr., otherwise known as Whitey, was an American organized crime boss and FBI informant wanted by the FBI. He was the boss of a largely Irish mob in Boston from the 1970s through the 1990s. In the early 2000s, the FBI actually decided to seek help from a crime show in Germany. They had them air photos of James and his girlfriend and told people to look out for them, saying that they were extremely dangerous and armed. Except there was one problem with that. They didn't double check the pictures that they sent in to be aired. Soon, calls were flooding in saying that they spotted this dangerous couple. However, the photos the FBI chose to broadcast were of his parents, harmless retirees. So for the next couple of days, they were doing damage control. How embarrassing. That's one reason why the FBI wants you to forget about this case. In our 9th spot, we have the wire fail. This next story about the FBI is literally gonna make you facepalm. So basically, in 2010, Brooks Kellogg was accused of hiring a hitman to try and murder a coworker who sued him for $2.5 million. So the FBI decided to do a sting operation to get Kellogg to confess to his wrongdoings. So they sent an undercover agent in with a hidden camera and audio equipment. Only problem is that there was a faulty wire. Now, wouldn't you think that they would double, even triple check to make sure that there were no technical issues before sending him in? But they didn't, so it didn't record audio during the confrontation. As a result, he was almost let off the hook. In our 8th spot today, we have the fantasy tape. In 2008, the FBI was investigating an unsolved murder case when a tape was sent to them. On the tape, it sounded like someone getting tortured. Ultimately, they thought that this tape had to do with the unsolved case that they were working on. Boy, were they wrong, and it's embarrassing. Turns out that the tape actually belonged to a Tennessee judge. His secretary handed it over to the police after she was fired, and it's not of someone being tortured. The judge had made a tape of his sexual fantasies. Apparently, the tape contained, and I quote, graphic, erotic situations intertwined with legal dictation made by now former Judge Hagler. Due to this scandal, the judge did resign. How embarrassing for both the judge and the FBI, who thought that it was a solid lead. In our 7th spot, we have Whitey Bulger Part 2. So like I mentioned, this guy was an organized crime figure that also was an informant for the FBI. And the FBI knew that. In fact, they ignored that side of him if he promised to give them information about the inner workings of an Italian American crime family. There's just a lot of things that they let slide with this guy that they definitely shouldn't have. Plus, one of the reasons why he was on the run in the first place was because his former FBI handler told him that they were coming for him. So he fled and went into hiding for 16 years. Imagine that. Coming in at number 6, we have Christine Collins. In 1928, a woman named Christine Collins made headlines after her young son, Walter Collins, went missing. At that time, the FBI was dealing with a number of scandals, so they thought, hey, if we find this woman's missing son, that would look so great on us. In the end, they ended up finding her son and returning him to her. Only problem, it wasn't her son. The FBI was like, nonsense, this is your boy, you're just delusional. So they locked her in a psychiatric ward for 10 days. That's when it was revealed that the boy was indeed not her son. Sadly, her son was actually kidnapped and then murdered in a series of murders known as the Wineville Chicken Coop murders. But imagine that, like, you're crazy, lock her up, it is her son. Come on, man. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Beltway snipers. These were a series of coordinated shootings that occurred over the course of 23 days in October of 2002. 2 snipers randomly shot 13 people. 10 sadly died, while 3 survived but were left in critical condition. One of the victims was FBI intelligence analyst Linda Franklin. Fear quickly spread in the area, and the FBI was facing immense pressure to catch these guys before more people wound up dead. They were finally caught on October 24th of 2002 when the 2 men were found sleeping in their car at 3:15 a.m. 3 weeks to find cold-blooded killers, it seems kind of short, but the FBI was under tons of public pressure and were heavily scrutinized for not catching them sooner. In our 4th spot, we have the corruption. Just a couple of years ago, an ex-FBI special agent, Babak Bromund, was arrested after it was found that he was accepting bribes linked to an Armenian criminal organization. Not only that, but he was falsifying documents to cover up these bribes. He ended up being charged with 3 counts of making false statements to a government agency to cover his bribes, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit commit bribery of a public official. It was found that a lawyer linked to the criminal organization made regular bribe payments to and purchased gifts for Babbitt while he was an FBI agent working on national security matters. The lawyer apparently bought him a $36,000 motorcycle and paid him $30,000 for a down payment on a second home in Lake Tahoe. All this among other things. In return, Babbitt would do things for him like diffuse any law enforcement interests in him, and he would also search the FBI database and find out what dirt they had on him and others. In our third spot, we have Larry Nassar. Back in 2015, news broke that young women, a part of the USA gymnastics team, were being taken advantage of by gym owners, coaches, and staff, one of them being Larry Nassar. Larry is said to have taken advantage of at least 250 young women since 1992, and apparently the FBI severely mishandled this case. For example, in July of 2015, the FBI were first notified about the allegations against Larry. It took them until September 2016 until they started to actually investigate him. By then, 70 more athletes were taken advantage of by him. Not only that, but he was caught lying to the FBI on multiple occasions, and they did nothing about that. An attorney for 150 of the women called the FBI out and said, and I quote, "When an ordinary American citizen lies to the FBI in the course of an investigation, they are prosecuted. Yet no charges have been filed against anyone as a result of this 5-year investigation." In our second spot, we have Stoneman Douglas High School. In February of 2018, Nicholas Cruz went into Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland and shot at the students and staff. As a result, 17 people were killed and 17 more were left injured. Well, it turns out that the FBI had received a tip a month prior to the shooting. The tip told the FBI about Cruz's gun ownership, his desire to kill people, his erratic behavior, and even his social media posts, which were disturbing. All the signs of him conducting a school shooting were there, and they handed it to the FBI, and they basically did nothing. The FBI even admitted that they did not follow proper protocol on this tip. Had they might have been able to prevent this from happening. And in our number one spot today, we have Viola Liuzzo. Between 1960 and 1965, an FBI informant, Gary Thomas Rowe, was given the task to infiltrate the Ku plan. He then was to report to the FBI information on the group members and their activities. But he was told not to participate in attacks or violent situations. But he ignored this. In 1965, a white woman named Viola Liuzzo was murdered by this clan. They had fired shots into her car after noticing her passenger was a young black man. Gary was there when it happened, and he became an accessory to murder. To make matters worse, the FBI spread rumors that the victim, Viola, was a heroin addict, a member of the Communist Party, and that she abandoned her children to have sexual relationships with African Americans involved in the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, she was a civil rights worker that just wanted to help people, and all that stuff was just made up by the FBI.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Angel Resendez. Also known as the Railroad Killer, Angel is said to have committed somewhere around 23 horrific crimes during his spree in both the United States and Mexico in the 1990s. He went on to become known as the Railroad Killer because of the fact that most of his crimes were committed near railroads, where he had just jumped off of trains he was using to travel around the country. Most of his crimes took place in the homes of those he harmed, and usually after the crimes he'd linger around to eat their food and sometimes steal their sentimental items. Sometimes he'd even take jewelry to re-gift to his mother and sister. In June of 1999, he was listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and when his sister saw him there, she was worried he would continue harming people, so she thankfully contacted the authorities. After this, they were able to convince him to surrender, and he was sent to trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death by the jury, and although there were multiple appeal attempts, his death warrant was signed, and on June 27, 2006, he received his sentence. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who used Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in this case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At the same time, it was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully this case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good. In our number 8 spot today we have Richard Chase. This evil person is said to have taken the lives of 6 people within the span of a month between 1977 and 1978. That's a lot of people in a very short amount of time, which is absolutely terrifying. Before his crimes, Richard's life was already full of terrible stories and horrific acts that had him spending time in mental institutions before his crime spree. While at these facilities, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but after going through treatment and beginning medication, he was deemed to no longer be a threat to society and was released into his mother's care. Here's where things take a turn for the worse, however. Instead of helping take care of Richard, his mother instead weaned him off of his medication and got him all set up with his own apartment. Nice. Really helpful and cool of her. Initially, when he moved into the apartment, he had roommates, but eventually they all moved out and he was alone, which is when things really got wild. He began killing various animals, which he would then eat raw, sometimes mixing the organs with Coca-Cola in a blender and then drinking it. It's horrible. After this, he would unfortunately go on his killing spree, which had horrific details and would only end when he was startled by a visitor at the home of where his final crime took place. He fled the scene, but he was later caught and stood trial. Although there were many attempts to have him be spared of the death sentence, in the end this didn't work. In December of 1980, Richard was found passed away in his jail cell after taking too many of his prescribed medication. In our number 7 spot today we have Rodney Alcala. Rodney is a horrible monster who was convicted and sentenced to death for 5 killings that he committed in California from 1977 to 1979. He also received an additional 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 other killings in New York in 1971 and 1977. Rodney got away with his crimes for a while because he wasn't the top of the list of suspects because he was said to be the quote charming photographer. Rodney is often referred to as the dating game killer because of his appearance on the show, which, with what we now know about him, is absolutely horrifying. What's crazy is that he actually won the show he was on, but the episode's bachelorette refused to go on a date with him because she found him creepy. This is just a reminder to always trust your instincts. It isn't exactly known just how many victims Rodney had. It is potentially thought that it could be much higher than the number he was convicted for. In July of last year, Rodney passed away in prison at the age of 77. In our number 6 spot today we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40, he just couldn't remember the names of all of them. But, of course, he could remember the details of all of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only 1 count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted for 25 minutes straight, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly just unbelievable. In our number 5 spot today we have John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. This pair is referred to as the DC Snipers, and they were responsible for a series of coordinated attacks during a 3-week period in October of 2002. The pair took the lives of 10 people and critically injured 3 others during this spree, although their crimes spanned even before this and involved even more people. Their crimes were random and terrifying. People would just be going about their everyday tasks when this horrific pair would strike. Through a series of quote-unquote mistakes the pair made, they were able to be caught by authorities and arrested. In September of 2003, John Allen was sentenced to death, and this sentence was carried out in November of 2009. John Lee, on the other hand, was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, but very recently it was determined that his sentence needs to be re-looked at because of his young age when the crimes were committed. In our number 4 spot today we have Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. A 2 for 1 of the most horrific kind, this pair was often referred to as the tool toolbox killers. They received this name because most of what they used to commit their crimes would be items normally stored in a household toolbox. The pair committed 5 of these crimes in Southern California over a 5-month period in 1979. In the end, what led to their capture was when Roy met up with a friend with whom he had previously been incarcerated with. He confessed to the crimes to this person in great detail, and you know what this person did? They consulted their attorney about this horrifying confession, who then advised them to go to the authorities with the information. Thank goodness. Authorities, while they didn't have the evidence necessary to charge the men with the crimes at that time, were able to, through surveillance, find other things to arrest them for, while they searched their homes to find the evidence that they really did need. The pair stood trial, and in the end, Lawrence was sentenced to death, and Roy, who accepted a plea bargain and agreed to testify against Lawrence, received a life sentence. Lawrence died of natural causes while on death row in December of 2019, as did Roy at the California Medical Facility in 2020. FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas described Lawrence as the most disturbing individual for whom he has ever created a criminal profile. In our number 3 spot today, we have Robert Hansen. Robert is often referred to as the Butcher Baker, and his story truly is horrific. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because for over a decade he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness, where he would then stalk them like prey. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrifying crimes, he was just a soft-spoken baker. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling the streets at night. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Paulson, who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In our number 2 spot today, we have William Bonin. This horrible person is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 21 young men in Southern California from May of 1979 to June 1980. It is said that on at least 12 of these occasions he was assisted by one of his 4 known accomplices, and it is even speculated that he might be responsible for 15 more of these crimes that evidence hasn't officially been able to connect him to. He was often referred to as the freeway killer because of the fact that most of the bodies were found along the freeway of Southern California. The police surveilled William until they could catch him in the act, which they did. In the beginning he claimed innocence. I mean, they caught him in the act. It's kind of dumb to claim innocence, but after receiving an impassioned letter from one of the victim's mothers, which asked him to please share the location of her son's body, he confessed his guilt. But he made sure to clarify that it wasn't so the mother could be at peace or so that her pain could be eased. No, of course not. Instead, he said, quote, "I was dying for a hamburger and I knew if I went out with the cops they would get me a hamburger." At his first trial, the prosecutor described him as, quote, "the most arch-evil person who ever existed." William was convicted on 14 of his crimes and was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before his sentence was carried out in 1996. In our number 1 spot today, we have Israel Keyes. Israel is quite a prolific serial killer and truly is a terrifying person. While everyone on this list is horrible, Israel is particularly scary because of the fact that he had no MO or type. He just killed at random. In fact, he was so prepared for these random crimes that he left kill kits all over the US so that he would be prepared for whenever whoever he chose crossed his path. It isn't quite clear how many of these crimes he committed, and many missing persons reports that are still open could potentially be linked to him. It is said that Israel had a sort of admiration and obsession with other prolific serial killers like Ted Bundy or Robert Hansen, who we already talked about today. He even said, quote, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." So creepy. In March of 2012, Israel was finally apprehended and was to stand trial for his crimes, but unfortunately, while waiting for trial, he went on to take his own life. He left behind a note and a drawing of 11 skulls, which led authorities to believe that this may be the number of victims he had. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Quincy Allen. Quincy Allen is a man who went on a crime spree between July and August of 2002, where he took the lives of 4 people. His crime spree was actually inspired while he was in prison serving time for stealing a vehicle. It was here that a fellow inmate decided to start recruiting others and told him that he could get Quincy a job as a mafia hitman. When Quincy was released, he decided to buy a shotgun so he could start practicing. Man, I really wish he showed this kind of dedication to literally anything else. Quincy started off this horrific crime spree spree on July 7th, 2002 by attacking a 51-year-old homeless man who was sleeping at the time. Luckily, this man was able to survive the attack. His crimes continued until he was arrested on August 14th, 2002. After his arrest and trial, Quincy received a sentence of death and is still on death row awaiting execution. His sentencing did not deter him from the criminal life, however, as in 2009, Quincy, along with another inmate, planned an attack on a correctional officer at the prison they both reside at. Quincy was intended to be executed on January 8th, 2010, but there was a stay of execution that was accepted, and as of July 26, 2022, literally just over a month ago, Quincy's death sentence was overturned. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer is one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and he managed to elude police for 30 years. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50, and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and victims, which is just another level of being messed up. If you don't know how this story ends, buckle up though, because it is wild. So you know those like family DNA tests like 23andMe where you send in your DNA and then they send you back your genealogy? Well, basically these kinds of services helped identify who the real Golden State Killer was. In 2018, when Detective Paul Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded the Golden State Killer DNA profile, which they were able to obtain from the crime scenes, to the website GED Match, they were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents as this DNA match. From there, a genealogist made a large family tree, and then they were able to single out 2 main suspects. After covertly collecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them to the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James D'Angelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served, as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old and will definitely spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 8 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, or the Son of Sam, is an American serial killer who terrorized New York from July of 1976 to July of 1977. He took the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others, all while eluding the biggest manhunt in New York City history. He was one of those arrogant ones who leaves like little notes for the police promising to do it again, but his arrogant self was caught for his crimes, and he was arrested on August 10th, 1977 and was indicted for his crimes. He confessed to all of them and claimed that he was just obeying the orders of a demon that had manifested itself in the form of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. He was found mentally competent to stand trial, and he pleaded guilty to his crimes, which left him sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which yeah, duh, but he did say that he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as a part of that. These claims were investigated, but no one has ever been able to confirm or deny them. In our number 7 spot today, we have Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led by Charles Manson, and he was a willing participant for the horrible Tate and LaBianca crimes that took place on August 9th and 10th, 1969. In October of 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and extradited back to California. Once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree unalive and 1 count of conspiracy to commit unalive. He originally received a death sentence, but it ended up being commuted to life in prison. Get this, you guys, though, he was able to release a book while in prison, and he got married, and through conjugal visits, he was able to have 4 children. 4 children. But thankfully in 1996 they banned those kinds of visits for people serving life in prison, and in 2003 he got divorced because his wife had met someone else. I hope so. In our number 6 spot today, we have Scott Erskine. Early in life, Scott began to commit violent crimes against others that I truly cannot even speak about here on YouTube, they're so bad. He spent 4 years in prison for one of these crimes when he was around 17 years old, but when he was paroled after the 4 years, he immediately began committing crimes again. In 1993, Scott invited a woman who was waiting for the bus into his home and ended up holding her hostage for several days. After letting her go, he was quickly arrested and ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison. This is when he had to submit DNA to a database, and in March of 2001, that DNA was matched when the cold cases of the unsolved killings of Jonathan Sellers and Charlie Keever were reopened. In 2004, a jury sentenced him to death, and 6 days later he was transferred to San Quentin. In an interesting turn of events, Scott did die on death row, but it wasn't due to a scheduled execution. Scott died a couple of years ago in July of 2020 after contracting COVID-19. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles' story starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester, and soon after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps, using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back toward Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings, and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 4 spot today, we have Shawn Grate. Shawn is a serial killer who committed a series of crimes from 2006 until he was apprehended in 2016. Throughout his decade of criminal activity, it is thought that he took the lives of at least 5 people. So basically, his story is a little confusing, but in September of 2016, Shawn was arrested and later indicted for 2 killings as well as a kidnapping and harming a woman whose 911 call actually led to his arrest. At the same time, in another county next door, he was also being charged with 2 other deaths, as well as another one from all the way back in 2016. This final count from all of those years ago was actually an unsolved Jane Doe case who had been unidentified for 12 years. When Shawn confessed to this crime, he wasn't even sure who she was, he just said he believed her name was Dana. On May 7th, 2018, Shawn was convicted on 2 of the counts, and on March 1st, 2019, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the others, and on September 11th, 2019, he pleaded guilty to the additional count. In the end, he was sentenced to death and has remained on death row since that final plea and sentencing, and he is currently scheduled to be executed in 2025. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Zodiac Killer. This one had to make it on this list because while there are a plethora of terrifying people on this list, nothing is as terrifying as an uncaught serial killer, and the Zodiac is definitely the most prolific of them all. The Zodiac Killer took the lives of 5 people in the San Francisco Bay Area between 1968 and October of 1969. He was most known for targeting young couples or a lone male cab driver. Despite 2 people luckily and thankfully escaping his attempted evil doings, he has still never been caught. While no one has heard from the Zodiac since 1974, the case remains active in many different counties, and maybe one day we'll finally know who the real Zodiac is. In our number 2 spot today, we have Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman. Known as the serial shooters, the crimes these guys committed are definitely on the list of fears I have, which I'm pretty sure spawned from a Criminal Minds episode. These 2 were actively committing these crimes between May of 2005 and August of 2006. Basically, they were arsonists who would randomly set fire to objects, but they would also drive around and commit random drive-by shootings. That's the really scary part. The fire thing is also bad, don't get me wrong. There's just something about completely random violence that absolutely terrifies me. In the end, a series of tips is what led investigators to identify the perpetrators of these horrible crimes. In particular, one from a friend of Samuel who explained that Sam had actually confessed to some of the killings one night while drinking. In Dale's trial, he was found guilty of 80 out of the 87 felony charges that were brought forth, and that was all in one single trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death 6 times, and his brother, who was later found out to have assisted in some of the crimes, was sentenced to 25 years. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Doodler. While this nickname sounds very sweet, it, like everything else on this list, is very sinister. The nickname that this unidentified killer received is due to his practice of sketching his victims before taking their lives. This unidentified killer committed their crimes in the San Francisco area from January of 1974 to September of 1975, and they specifically targeted gay men. It is believed that 14 deaths can be attributed to this killer, while 3 others were injured in the process. Unfortunately, because of the stigma and sensitivity surrounding gay men at the time, the 3 who survived this monster were very reluctant when speaking with the authorities for fear of being outed as a result of it. This has led to there being very little information for them to work with in terms of identifying the man responsible. For a while there was a primary suspect, but that person has never been officially charged because sadly, none of the survivors felt comfortable enough to testify in court. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the alphabet. There are a lot of scary people on this list today, but some of the scariest people out there are the ones we know have committed horrific crimes but have yet to be identified. Yes, we are talking cold cases, unsolved crimes right now, and we are talking one of the worst. The alphabet killings are a series of unsolved crimes named because of how each victim had their first initial that matched their last. So like their first name and their last name started with the same letter. They know the crimes are linked, or at least have reason to suspect they are, because of a similar MO that includes how the life was taken and where the remains were placed afterwards. They were all taken in a similar area around a similar time. There are theories and suspects as to who could have committed these horrific crimes, but as of right now, no one knows for sure. These crimes were committed between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York, and because of the timing, it's possible that whoever committed these crimes could still be alive, but perhaps they're not. Authorities, despite having an immensely difficult job placed in front of them, are still committed and trying to solve this case. In our number 9 spot today, we have John Wayne Gacy. With a nickname like Killer Clown, it is abundantly clear why everyone would want to stay away from this actual monster. He got his start in this horrifying nickname by being a clown for children's birthday parties, charitable events, and that sort of thing. According to Gacy himself, all of his crimes were committed inside of his ranch house, where he would lure his victims into. He would then trick them into wearing handcuffs under the pretense that he was going to show some sort of a magic trick, and from here the horror unfortunately ensued. It is thought that he took the lives of somewhere around 33 young men, most of which he buried in a crawl space in his home. On the evening of December 11th, 1978, Gacy took the life of his last victim, Robert Peist. Gacy lured the young man in when he went into the pharmacy that he worked at, and while talking with the store owner, loudly declared so that Robert could hear that he often hired teenagers for his firm at a starting rate of $5 per hour, which was double what Robert was getting at the pharmacy. In hopes of getting a new good job, Robert ended up inquiring further after his shift at the pharmacy was over. When Robert's mother filed a missing persons report, the pharmacy owner was able to explain that Gacy was likely the person he went to speak to about a job, and when the police looked into Gacy's background, all the pieces were there just waiting to be put together. Subsequent investigation, questioning, and searches led police to gather all of the evidence they needed to arrest and charge him, and his conviction for 33 killings was, at the time, the most by one individual in the United States legal history. He was sentenced to death on March 13th, 1980, and on May 10th, 1994, he was executed by lethal injection, and I'm not gonna lie, I think that's something we can all be grateful for. In our number 8 spot today, we have Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine was a New Orleans socialite who was an evil person behind closed doors. It is said that in public, Delphine was polite and appeared as if she cared for those who were enslaved in her home, which is the most ridiculous sentence I've ever said, but that's what the accounts of people who lived in this time said. Delphine's social standing remained until, on April 10th, 1834, authorities responded to a fire at her Royal Street mansion. When they arrived and went inside, no one was prepared for the horrors they were about to see, as they discovered bound slaves in her attic who had clear signs of violent behavior over a very long period of time. Following this, her house was swarmed by an outraged group of New Orleans citizens, but somehow Delphine was able to escape with her family to France. While the angry group destroyed her entire home, Delphine never faced any punishments for her crimes, which is one of the most frustrating endings to this horrible, awful story. In our number 7 spot today, we have Lester Eubanks. If you're a fan of unsolved mysteries, you might be familiar with this story. Lester is a man who is convicted and sentenced to prison in 1966 for taking someone's life. In December of 1973, Lester was a part of an honor assignment that gave him the opportunity to be at the mall to do some Christmas shopping. While at the mall, he ended up escaping custody and has been on the run ever since. Through investigations into his family and friends, police were led to a center for troubled youth where he was said to have been working, but Lester was nowhere to be found. The most recent development in this case came in 2019 when Lester's biological son agreed to give a DNA sample which could be used to link Lester to recent crimes and maybe give an idea on where he could be hiding, but FBI policies that you cannot not search using a family member's DNA. It's crazy that someone could be on the run for so long without anyone recognizing or finding them, and it makes me really wonder if anyone in his new life knows about his dark past. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Honolulu Killer. This is another one of those pesky, horrifying, unidentified serial who of course was active in and around Honolulu, Hawaii. These crimes took place in 1985 and 1986, and throughout those years it is said that whoever is responsible for these crimes took the lives of at least 5 women. The women seemingly didn't have any connection to each other as they were all from different walks of life, but because of the gruesome similarities of each crime, authorities were able to determine that they were likely committed by the same person. Despite the years it's been, the perpetrator has never been identified and could still be out there somewhere, hiding from taking responsibility for their actions. In our number 5 spot today, we have Daniel Perez. Daniel Perez might be better known by his alias Lou Castro, but he truthfully is just best not being known at all because he sucks. Daniel led a cult that was located on a 20-acre property in a rural area just north of Wichita. He convinced his followers that he had magical powers, and he told them all that he was a centuries-old angel who needed to commit some horrific crimes in order to stay alive. Weird story. These crimes would have certainly been more than enough to throw him on this list, but he of course just couldn't stop at committing one type of crime. He had to make sure he just really stole the show on being the worst. Basically, he had this clever idea to use his followers' life insurance policies to live a lavish lifestyle, like as if no one would think that's weird or suspicious. While some of these life insurance policies were collected through regular means, of course that kind of greed only leads to evil things, which of course means that he ended up taking one of his followers' lives so he could collect the cash. It is thought that he also contributed to the deaths of some of the other people's life insurance policies he cashed in on, but unfortunately there was never any evidence that would be able to substantiate that claim. Despite this, however, on April 21st, 2010, authorities were able to arrest Daniel and he was charged with 28 felonies. In February of 2015, he was convicted on all counts and received a sentence of 80 years in jail. In our number 4 spot today, we have the I-70. This is the name of what is believed to be an unidentified serial who is known to have taken the lives of 6 store clerks in the Midwest in the spring of 1992. The reason he is referred to as the I-70 killer is because most of the stores were just a few miles off of Interstate 70. While most of his victims were women, there was one man, but it is believed that he may have been expecting a female employee. The killings were clearly the main objective of his crimes as well, considering the fact that at each scene there was only a small amount of cash that was taken. Aside from these initial 6 crimes, it is thought that he also might be responsible for the deaths of 3 more store clerks in Texas in 1993 and 1994, as well as 1 more in Indiana in 2001. This story has been featured on episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, and Dark Minds, but despite this, whoever is responsible has never been identified. In our number 3 spot today, we have Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski is most often referred to as the Unabomber due to the atrocious crimes that he committed. He was known as being quite bright from a young age, and it is believed that he had an IQ of about 167. He was accepted into Harvard at the age of just 16, and he went on to receive a PhD. At 25, things were still looking bright for the guy as he had landed himself a job as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, but 2 years later he resigned from that position and his life took quite a drastic and dark turn. In 1971, it is said that Ted moved to a remote cabin in Montana that had no electricity or running water. From 1971 until 1977, Ted learned to live a hermit, off-the-grid style life while learning different survival skills, but once 1978 rolled around, he was ready to start his terror campaign. From here until 1995, he began a nationwide against people who were involved with modern technology. He planted these weapons or would mail them, and in the end took the lives of 3 people and severely injured 23. Just like many of these kinds of people, his own ego and delusions got in the way because on April 24th, 1995, he sent an anonymous handwritten letter that was addressed to the police via the New York Times. His own brother ended up recognizing his handwriting, however, and that's the tip that he gave to the FBI. Ted was captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison prison with no possibility of parole. In our number 2 spot today, we have Dorothea Puente. You know the saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, this is certainly a case of that. If you took one glance at Dorothea and knew nothing about her, you'd probably assume she was someone's kind grandma who also had some cookies and a glass of milk waiting around, but that could not be any further from the actual truth. She was actually a serial and she decided to prey upon some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, people who were seeking help and assistance. Dorothea operated a large rooming house that was set in a large Victorian home in Sacramento, California. The residents who would often stay there were people who struggled with different substances such as alcohol, people who had been in mental hospitals, and the elderly. All of these people were receiving social security checks, and if they suddenly vanished, she figured no one would ask. In 1982, they did begin to vanish, but of course, their social security checks were continually being cashed. Of course, as it turns out, Dorothea was taking their lives and then their money. She has now been called the landlady from hell. In our number 1 spot today, we have Albert Fish. Albert is one of the oldest people on this list, but that does not mean his crimes were any less horrific than anyone else's. Dubbed the Brooklyn Vampire or the Moon Maniac or even the Boogeyman himself, it is clear that Albert was a terrible human being who did terrible things. In the early 1900s, Albert was arrested, tried, and convicted for killing and eating 3 people, but the horror was not over here. No, Albert began to claim that although people knew about 3, the number was actually closer to 100, and he even claimed that he had some in every state. That's disgusting. To make matters even worse, as if this wasn't already terrible enough, this deranged lunatic also sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims. He detailed everything about how he lured her and the rest of the horrific things that occurred afterwards, like how he proceeded to eat her over the course of 9 days. Yeah, this is another person that I'm not sad at all that they don't exist anymore. It's perfectly fine by me.
And at number 10 is Ted Kaczynski. Ted Unabomber Kaczynski was an anarchist and a mathematical prodigy. He excelled academically from an early age and has an insanely high IQ of 167. He made it into Harvard University at just 16 years old and ultimately gained a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. Now, not too much later, he had become an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, but after handing in his resignation, things started to go downhill. The Unabomber became a hermit and moved to a remote cabin in Lincoln, Montana. Between 1978 and 1995, he took the lives of 3 people and injured 23 others with homemade explosive devices. His manifesto was published in the Washington Post after being sent to the press anonymously, and it explained that the devices were extreme but necessary to attract attention to the erosion of human freedom necessitated by modern technologies requiring large-scale organization. I didn't write that, in case you were curious. That wasn't me. Anyways, he was caught when his brother read the letters in the news, recognized Ted's handwriting, and tipped off the FBI. The Unabomber was finally caught and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Number 9, Andrew Cunanan. Andrew Cunanan was incredibly intelligent as well, with an IQ of 147, but Cunanan was also a tactical liar. He would claim that his father was an Israeli millionaire, and he displayed early signs of antisocial personality disorder. To fund the lavish lifestyle that he craved, Cunanan would make friends of wealthy older men, which worked out for him when he moved in with millionaire Norman Blatchford, who treated him to luxury cars and vacations in southern France. But that didn't last, as Blatchford finally had enough of Cunanan and he was thrown out. Now, this hit to his ego led to the passing of at least 5 different people, including Chicago tycoon Lee Miglin and Gianni Versace, on July 15th, 1997. In June of 1997, Cunanan became the 449th fugitive to be listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. It wasn't too much longer after the passing of Versace that Andrew's body was discovered in a Miami Beach houseboat, having taken his own life. Number 8, Thomas James Holden. Thomas James Holden was the first man to ever make the most wanted list of the FBI, so he kind of had to make this list. His criminal career began in the 1920s with the robbery of a mail train and didn't stop there at all. In 1930, he escaped from Leavenworth Penitentiary and was recaptured on a golf course in Kansas City. He was on parole in 1949 and drinking with his wife and her 2 brothers when an argument broke out, resulting in Holden taking the life of all 3, then fleeing with the FBI on his trail. He evaded them for quite some time, but the FBI caught him 13 months later after receiving a tip from a man in Oregon. Just a reminder, if you guys are enjoying what you're seeing, make sure to give us a like. It's all we really need to feel your support. Thanks guys. Number 7. James Earl Ray. While Holden was the first man to make the list, James Earl Ray was the first man to make the most wanted list twice. His first crime is his most famous, as he was first wanted by the FBI for taking the life of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. He was captured 2 months later when a customs official at Heathrow Airport recognized his alias from a Canadian wanted list, but in 1977 he escaped from a Tennessee penitentiary, leading him to be put back on that list. But not for too long, as 3 days later he was recaptured and a year was added to his sentence, bringing it up to a grand total of 100 years, which kinda seems a little pointless, but I get it. Number 6. Victor Manuel Garena. While not the most evil, especially compared to most of the others on this list, Victor Manuel Garena has the longest membership on the FBI's most wanted list. In 1984, Garena was a Wells Fargo security guard who turned on 2 fellow workers in their Wells Fargo armored car. He isn't the most evil because all he did to the 2 other co-workers is tie them up, but he then fled with $7 million taken from the truck and was literally never seen again. To this day, the FBI is still offering a $1 million reward for information leading to his arrest. It would be insane if he happened to actually be caught at this point. Number 5. Omar August Pinson. Omar August Pinson brings us back to the more evil side of things, as he was convicted of slaying an on-duty Oregon police officer before he made a jailbreak. Omar managed to evade capture on the run for almost a year, and even made it out of a shootout in January 1950 with Montana police completely unscathed. The problem for Pinson here came when a car salesman identified him and gave the FBI enough clues to track him down. He was recaptured in September 1950 and returned to prison, making parole in the early 70s. Number 4. William Bradford Bishop Jr. William Bradford Bishop Jr. made the list for pretty brutally taking the life of his wife, mother, and he disappeared in 1976. In the next few years, witnesses claim to have seen him in several different locations overseas, but he still hasn't been caught. Bishop wasn't added to the FBI's most wanted list until 2014, when the Bureau had produced an age-advanced image of him to aid in his capture, but it failed to turn up any leads, and 2 years later he was dropped from the list again. He would now be 84 years old if he is still alive, but we just might not ever know, which is kinda not a great feeling. Number 3. Robert William Fisher. Robert Fisher is actually on the current FBI most wanted list for taking the life of his wife and their 2 children before blowing up the house that they all lived in Scottsdale, Arizona in April 2001. He was described as a cruel and distant control freak towards his family. He and his wife would fight a lot, and Fisher was embarrassed that his son Bobby did not like to hunt or fish, and once tried to teach him and his daughter how to swim by throwing them off of a boat. Fisher was also very controlling about the house they lived in, not allowing the walls in the house to be painted anything other than white, and only a small number of pictures were allowed on the wall. Any sentimental objects of his wife's had to be kept hidden away. He's still out there, so watch out. Number 2. Eduardo Ravello. Guess what? I have another guy who is included on the current FBI's most wanted list, just to keep you a little on your toes, you know? Eduardo Ravello was indicted in Texas in 2008 for his alleged involvement in racketeering activities, conspiracy to launder monetary instruments, aka money, and conspiracy to possess substances with the intent to distribute them. His criminal activities began in 2003, and Ravello is known to be a captain within the Barrio Azteca American-Mexican criminal enterprise, and is allegedly responsible for issuing orders to the Barrio Azteca members, who allegedly act as hitmen for an even bigger substance trafficking organization. Apparently, in total, they are responsible for a whole number of lost lives. Ravello himself has ties to Mexico and El Paso, Texas, and it's presumed that he may have had plastic surgery and altered his fingerprints, but he's still out and about at the moment. And in at number 1 is Ted Bundy. I bet you were wondering if more recognizable names would show up on this list. Well, you were right. The vicious serial killer Ted Bundy was actually a two-time member of the FBI's most wanted list, who committed his first known killing in 1974. Following his first, Bundy unfortunately took 12 more lives during his time until one of his victims escaped, but even then, before he could actually be arrested in 1975, he did it again 5 more times. During his 1977 trial, he escaped from the courthouse through a window and was most wanted for 6 days before recapture, but like I said, he was on that list twice, as later that year, he escaped again. He committed 3 more attacks and took 2 more lives before finally being stopped for driving a stolen car. Thankfully, this monster can never escape again, as he was put to the electric chair in 1989.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Keith Hunter Jesperson. Also known as the Happy Face Killer, Keith was so desperate for attention for his crimes, it might have led to his own demise. Keith is a killer who, after the body of his first victim was found, had someone else actually claim to be responsible for his crimes. When you're trying to get away with killing people, having someone else falsely confess to your crime would likely seem like the best case scenario, right? Well, not for Keith. He wanted to be known for his crimes, so to help himself get media attention, he drew a smiley face on a bathroom wall hundreds of miles away from his crime scene, and here he left an anonymous letter where he confessed to the crime and provided proof. He didn't end up receiving a reply, so he decided to write more letters to the media and to authorities, each signed with a smiley face. In the end, Keith was initially caught after he became the prime suspect in the death of his girlfriend at the time. Previously, his victims had been people he had no connection to, so this truly was the mistake the authorities needed to catch him. Keith then admitted to his crimes, and while he has formally been linked to 8 deaths, he has confessed to somewhere around 185. Keith was tried and sentenced to life without parole for his heinous crimes, and he remains in prison at Oregon State Penitentiary. In our number 9 spot today, we have Franklin Dwayne Alex. Franklin is a man who had quite an insane crime spree that lasted for about 6 months in the 1990s. Although short, it was anything but sweet. This spree started off in August of 1997 in Houston, Texas. Over the course of this spree, Franklin took the lives of at least 3 people. He committed robberies, he harmed people, he attempted to take more lives where thankfully the people survived, he kidnapped people, literally any serious crime he could commit during those 6 months he was doing it. In the end, Franklin was caught and put on trial for his crime spree, and he received a sentence of death, which was carried out on March 30th, 2010. In our number 8 spot today, we have David Parker Ray. Often referred to as the Toy Box Killer, this guy is anything but fun. This serial killer nickname comes from how he soundproofed a semi-trailer, which he called his toy box, and he equipped it full of everything a nightmare human being would need to commit his horrific crimes. Here's the thing, although he was highly suspected of taking lives, there was never enough evidence to prove it because the bodies were never found. This means that although many people are quite sure that he did such things, he was never officially tried for it. He was, however, tried and convicted for kidnapping as well as for harming those he had taken. He would sometimes include his wife in these instances, she was a willing participant, and then many of those he took he would later drop off on the side of the road somewhere after using barbiturates in an attempt to destroy their memories that could potentially identify him. Whether he took any lives or not is still up for debate, I suppose, but that does not mean he is any better than anyone else on this list. He is equally as horrible of a person. In the end, David was convicted for his crimes, which is thought to be up in the range of about 60 instances in 2001, and then he died of a heart attack in 2002 in prison. In our number 7 spot today, we have Arthur Shawcross. This man is also known as the Genesee River Killer, and his crime spree began in 1972. In trying to navigate these online guidelines, I can't exactly say who he specifically targeted, but what I will say is that while everyone on this list is particularly horrible, Arthur's were some of the worst, if you catch my drift. This story, however, is a little unlike some of the others today because after the first 2 of his crimes, he was apprehended, but for some insane reason, they allowed him to have a plea bargain where he was allowed to plead guilty to just 1 charge of only manslaughter, for which he served 14 years of his 25-year sentence. In the least surprising turn of events, once he was released on early probation, his real crime spree got started. He would go on to take the lives of 12 women from 1988 and 1989. Thankfully, Thankfully, he was finally caught for these crimes and sent right back to prison. Of course, his initial early release was the subject of huge controversy, rightfully, and Dr. Michael H. Stone, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, called this early release, quote, one of the most egregious examples of the unwarranted release of a prisoner. In the end, Arthur passed away in prison while serving a 250-year sentence. He passed in 2008 after suffering a heart attack. In our number 6 spot today, we have Richard Ramirez. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of Los Angeles in the 1980s. He was known for his MO of invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the walk-in killer, but he had another signature that was concerning to many people, especially during the height of the Satanic Panic. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of the crime, authorities became worried that he was a Charles Manson copycat, but instead he was just his own kind of monster. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, "Hail Satan." In our number 5 spot today, we have the Colonial Parkway Monster. Between 1986 and 1989, there were 3 couples who were found in their cars after their lives had been taken, and all of these couples were found along Virginia's Colonial Parkway. Although this is a horrific thing that investigators believed to be linked, all these years later, whoever is responsible for these crimes remains somewhere at large. There are plenty of theories as to who could have done this, just like with any cold case of this kind, but terrifyingly, many people believe that the culprit may have been someone impersonating a police officer. This is because each of the victims were found with their glove compartments open, which some believe indicates that they were reaching for their registration, and this might be the reason as to why they even pulled over in the first place. This is just a theory, however, and true or not, at this point it isn't bringing us any closer to finding out who is really responsible for these horrific crimes. In our number 4 spot today, we have Michael Bear Carson and Susan Carson. This couple is not one that anyone would want to encounter. The stories of these two come from the 80s. They were married, and on the outside they appeared just like a couple of harmless hippies. We all know not to judge a book by its cover though. In the end, they would go on to become known as the San Francisco Witch Killers. Yeah, not just a thing for Salem in the 1600s, unfortunately. Basically, together the pair took the lives of 3 separate people between 1981 and 1983. They started off by killing their roommate, who Susan claimed was a witch, and said that she was stealing her quote health, power, and beauty. Sounds like someone was a little jealous to me. They next killed one guy that they worked on a farm with because they said that he was a demon. The final person they took the life of unfortunately picked up the pair as they were hitchhiking, and they took his life because they claimed that he was a quote black witch, whatever that means. Essentially, they were just committing crimes against people that they claimed to be witches. The pair were each tried and convicted for each separate crime and are both serving sentences of 75 years to life. Neither of them have shown any kind of remorse for what they've done. In our number 3 spot today, we have Kenneth Bianchi. The Hillside Strangler, which was later found out to be a pair of cousins working together, were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. The two were charged and convicted for harming and taking the lives of 10 separate women together, with Kenneth taking the lives of 2 others on his own. After an extremely intensive investigation and the arrest of the two, Kenneth began to try and set up an insanity defense. He claimed dissociative identity disorder. He blamed his alter ego Steve for the horrific multitude of crimes. Luckily, however, a court psychologist, Dr. Martin Orn, observed him and his behavior and found that his claims were untrue. After being presented with this finding, Kenneth agreed to plead guilty and testify against his cousin in exchange for leniency on his sentence. He ended up being sentenced to life in prison, with his cousin getting sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. While Angelo had a heart attack and passed in 2002, Kenneth still remains in prison. In our number 2 spot today, we have Vicki Dawn Jackson. Vicki was a woman who worked as a nurse for a number of years. She first got her nursing license in 1989, but it wasn't until the 2000s when things took a very dark turn. Between December of 2000 and February of 2001, the hospital that Vicki was working for recorded a number of deaths that was unusual. It was a higher amount. Most of these patients were in the age range of 60 to 100 years old, so of course people just chalked this up to the advanced age of most of these patients, but a rumor began to spread that someone just might be responsible. After this, the hospital's administrator noticed that a vial of called Mivacron had gone missing. You might see where I'm going with this. As it turns out, the person responsible was Nurse Vicky, and she had at least 10 patients whose lives she took by giving them too much of this missing drug. It was a muscle relaxant. Take in that this is 10 people between December and February. That is an unbelievable amount of people in a remarkably short amount of time. You might be wondering why she took these lives, and apparently she did it when she found those people rude or, quote, too demanding. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Axemen of New Orleans. Unfortunately, this is not the name of some terrible horror flick, and instead it is the moniker given to a terrible, unidentified serial killer. This person was active in New Orleans, Louisiana, and its surrounding areas from May of 1918 to October 1919. As the name implies, those who were targeted by this person were usually attacked with an axe, and it was usually one that actually belonged to the victims themselves. Many people believe that this person may have been targeting people of Italian descent because this was the theme among the victims, and some also believe that he was mainly targeting women and only took the lives of men when they tried to intervene. This is actually somewhat supported by the homes where women were killed but the men weren't. In the end, although this person is responsible for taking at least 12 lives, exactly who the Axeman is or was remains a mystery. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Darren Dion Van. Back in 2014, Darren Dion Van was arrested after he was charged with taking the life of a woman. After his arrest, however, the true extent of his crimes would come to light when he suddenly confessed to taking the lives of at least 6 others that authorities hadn't previously known about. The story of Darren and his arrest starts back in 2009 when he was convicted of a horrible crime in Texas. He served 5 years for this crime before being released and heading back to his home state of Indiana in July of 2013. Once here is when he committed the horrific crime he would again be arrested for when he took the life of 19-year-old Africa Hardy. He left her in a motel room, but what he didn't know is that the surveillance cameras caught him and placed him at the scene of the crime, which thankfully led to his arrest. When he was questioned for the crime is when he admitted to the others as well. Of course, investigators were a little skeptical of these claims, but Darren actually went out and was able to lead investigators to the bodies that he had left in abandoned buildings around Gary, Indiana. He of course was charged with all of the crimes, and while he could have received a death sentence, he instead received 7 concurrent life sentences, of course without parole. In our number 9 spot today, we have Salvatore Perrone, also referred to as the son of Sal. This American serial killer terrorized the streets of Brooklyn for months back in 2012. People were terrified as there was some sort of unidentified killer who was taking the lives of shopkeepers. Basically, this monster was specifically targeting shopkeepers who were of Middle Eastern descent. He would go into the store around closing time when they were alone, and he would use the same sawed-off weapon in each attack. In the end, after his months of terror, Salvatore took the lives of Isaac Kader, who was 59, Mohammed Gabelli, who was 65, and Ramatal Vidapur, who was 78. After someone was thankfully able to identify Salvatore based off of a photo that authorities were circulating, they were able to obtain a warrant to search his girlfriend's home. Here, they found a duffel bag that he actually had with him in the photo that was used to identify him, and in the bag were 2 weapons, and through ballistic and blood testing, experts were able to tie these weapons to the cases. Although Salvatore was never charged with hate crimes, he was charged with the 3 killings, and after a very tumultuous trial where he continually had outbursts that claimed his innocence, it only took the jury 30 minutes to come back with a conviction. Salvatore was sentenced to the maximum sentence of 75 years to life in prison, but not before Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Alan Morris said, "You're lucky we don't have the death penalty here in New York. You would be a prime candidate." In our number 8 spot today, we have Michael Madison. On July 19th, 2013, police were called to a neighborhood after there were reports of a horrible smell. Unfortunately, this investigation would turn out to yield horrifying results when authorities searched a garage and found a decomposing body inside. The following day, they found 2 more bodies, one in a backyard and the other in the basement of a house that was sitting vacant. The garage where the first body was found was leased to a man named Michael Madison, and because of this gruesome discovery, police got a warrant and entered his apartment, where it is said that they found, quote, further evidence of decomposition. Of course, authorities quickly took Michael into custody, not without a brief standoff, and they also worked to identify the victims. They found out that they had been Shatisha Sheely, she was 28 years old and had been missing since September of 2012. Angela Deskins, she was 38 and was a resident of Cleveland who was reported missing in June 2013. And finally, Sherelda Helen Terry, who was just 18 and was last seen on July 10th, 2013, leaving a Cleveland elementary school where she had a summer job. On July 22nd, 2013, Michael was charged with the crimes, and he had his bail set at $6 million, and he waived his right to a preliminary hearing. Michael did confess to his crimes, but let's not confuse that for remorse or apologies. When he appeared in court, he taunted and smiled at the families of the victims. In fact, it was so bad that one of the victims' fathers, Van Terry, attacked this monster from the witness stand. In the video, which did go viral, Van said, "I guess we're supposed to find it in our hearts to forgive this clown," after which he appears to have had enough of the smug attitude of this horrifying person, and he just snapped and flew across the courtroom. A move that not a single person could possibly blame him for. In the end, Michael was sentenced to death for his horrific crimes. In our number 7 spot today, we have Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Known as the Grim Sleeper, this serial is believed to have taken the lives of at least 25 women, if not dozens to hundreds more, between the years of 1985 to 2007. He got his nickname from the fact that he took a break from his crimes between 1988 and 2002. There are a lot of details about these crimes and his history that really is too dark for me to talk about here on YouTube, but what I can tell you is the way that this monster got caught. While these killings were stumping detectives for decades, when the LAPD started their cold case unit, it was discovered that the killer of 7 women in the 80s was able to be connected through ballistics and DNA to deaths in 2002, 2003, and 2007. This was a really important break in the case, but while they had the DNA, there was no match in CODIS, which is the national DNA database. Finally, however, when 2010 rolled around, Lonnie was caught because his son was arrested for a completely unrelated crime, and because of this, he had to give a DNA swab. This swab, through familial DNA testing, finally was the missing puzzle piece, and it showed that this son was related to the killer that they were looking for. This is when detectives followed Lonnie into a pizza place. As he finished up his meal, a detective who was posing as a busboy came and collected some items like a fork, plastic cups, a plate, and a pizza slice. A few days later, DNA from these items came back as a match to the DNA found on one of the victims, and they were finally able to arrest and charge Lonnie. On August 10th, 2016, the Los Angeles Superior Court sentenced him to death for each of the 10 victims named in the verdict, and on March 28, 2020, Lonnie was found passed away in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. The cause of death has never officially been released. In our number 6 spot today, we have Ahmad Siraji. This is the name of an Indonesian serial who was responsible for taking the lives of 42 women between 1986 and 1997. Once caught for one crime, he explained to the police that he had a dream in 1986 where his father's ghost told him that if he drank the saliva of 70 women who had passed away, he would become some sort of mystic healer with unbelievable abilities. All of the women whose lives he took, he buried them near his home with their heads facing towards his home because he believed this would give him more power. In this dream, apparently his father didn't tell him to kill, but because he thought it would take so long to get the saliva of 70 passed away women, he thought that this would help him speed up the process. The entire process of his crimes was very ritualistic and brutal, and often the victims of these crimes were women who had come to him for help since he was advertising himself as some kind of a sorcerer. Ahmad had 3 wives who were all sisters, and they too were arrested for assisting in these crimes and for helping him hide the bodies. One of his wives was even tried as his accomplice and was sentenced to death before her sentence was commuted to life in prison. For Ahmad, on the other hand, he too was sentenced to death by the firing squad, but this time it was carried out on July 10th, 2008. In our number 5 spot today, we have Leonarda Cianciulli. Also known as the soap maker of Correggio, Leonarda was an Italian serial killer who lived from 1893 until 1970. Basically, in her youth, Leonarda visited a fortune teller who told her that she was going to have many children, but that they would all pass away before she did. It's very Game of Thrones, and Leonarda definitely decided to take the Lannister way. Leonarda took the lives of 3 separate people and turned them into soap and tea cakes using caustic soda. Leonarda's son went to join the Italian army in preparation for World War II, and during this time, she figured the only way to protect him was by doing human sacrifices. One of the worst parts of these crimes, aside from, the crime itself, is that she fed these tea cakes that she had made to people who would come to visit, along with eating them herself and feeding them to her son. Authorities caught on to her crimes when one of her victim's family members began to get suspicious about the disappearance. In the end, Leonardo was arrested and charged and ended up being sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. In our number 4 spot today, we have Vlado Teneski. Vlado was a Macedonian journalist who turned into a serial killer in the hopes of getting a good story. Yep. Absolutely wild. His crimes took place between 2005 and 2008, and it all started because he really wanted a good story, and he knew that a vicious killer on the loose would entice readers more than anything, and with special inside info, who would possibly have a better scoop on the story. This is what led him to these horrific crimes against 3, possibly 4 elderly women who he took the lives of and then wrote stories about, pretending as if he didn't. Sure enough, his plan did work. For a while. People were raving about his reports, but it would be these reports that went on to reveal his true identity and what was really going on. He first came under suspicion after having written the 3 articles about the killings, and this then led to him being questioned. This is because his articles contained information that actually hadn't yet been released to the public. Like in one instance, his report included that the killer had used a telephone cord, and that this cord had been left behind at the scene. Something that only authorities knew but hadn't yet made public, so of course, how could he possibly know? Finally, he was arrested on June 20th, 2008 after his DNA was able to be connected to DNA found on one of the victims. Unfortunately, Vladio wouldn't live long enough to stand trial because he decided he couldn't face the consequence of his own actions, and so he took his own life in his prison cell on June 23rd, 2008. In our number 3 spot today, we have Charles Manson. I'm not entirely sure how we got to part 6 without talking about Charles Manson, but here we are. Manson was released from prison in 1967, where he then moved to San Francisco, and this is where he gained a small following that would eventually go on to be the cult known as The Family. The group eventually moved to an abandoned ranch outside of Los Angeles, and it was here that Manson continued to brainwash his followers and manipulate them with his own religious philosophies. Manson claimed that there would be an upcoming race war in which white people would all be killed, which was intended to instill fear in his followers. This was so that he could ignite a race war and sent his followers on a killing spree, which ended up being the night of the horrible Tate and LaBianca killings. This led to a reign of terror in the Los Angeles area for several months because people just couldn't understand how or why this happened. In our number 2 spot today, we have Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin is a serial killer who was convicted for 3 separate crimes, but it is believed his crimes may actually be up in the range of 40 to 50. Before being convicted of these crimes, Peter also served another 10 years in prison for other crimes committed, and he was released from prison for these crimes in 2004. 3 years later, however, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years for taking the life of Angelica Kluk in 2006. After this, remains of 2 more people who went missing in 1991 were found in his former home, and he was also tried for these crimes, which ended up solidifying his sentence to a whole life order, which means he will never be up for parole. There are some believe Tobin is responsible for more unsolved crimes, and he has been labeled a psychopath by a senior psychologist. Apparently, while in prison, he has boasted about taking the lives of 48 people, despite the fact that he's only officially been linked to 3. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Sam Little. Sam Little is well known for being one of the worst serial killers ever. He has confessed to taking the lives of more than 90 people, and while authorities have only been able to definitively connect him to 30, they say that they have no reason to doubt the validity of any of his other confessions. Sam was able to continue on this horrible path for so many years because of the fact that he committed these crimes in different states and different counties, which made it more difficult to connect his crimes to one another. In an interview with an investigator named Sergeant LeBlanc, as they discussed religious beliefs, they spoke about the nature of sin. Sam stated that he had no fear of God and said that God made him this way, so why should he ask for forgiveness? He said that God knew everything that he did, and he also allegedly told a few select people that he believed that he was the devil. Starting off this list today in our number 10 spot, we have Harold Shipman. Coined with the terrifying nickname Dr. Death, Harold Shipman is thought to be responsible for taking the lives of 218 of his patients from 1972 to 1998. Because of his obvious position as a physician, he was able to fly under the radar for so long despite committing so many of these atrocious crimes. This is, in the end, what led to his downfall, however. Because so many of his patients were passing away, people started to get suspicious, and this was only exacerbated by the fact that he claimed many of his patients, who were normally elderly women, had passed away in their sleep, but when people started to notice that many of them had actually passed away during the day, people began to get concerned about what sinister secrets may be hiding in the dark. This all coupled with the fact that Harold had asked for an unusually large number of cremation certificates, which ended up catching the attention of a local undertaker, was enough to bring the authorities, who began to investigate. For a while it was believed that Harold should be cleared of all suspicion, until the death of an 81-year-old under mysterious circumstances. Her family demanded an investigation because they noticed that her insurance beneficiary had been changed to Harold, which obviously was a major red flag. I mean, I love my doctor, but I'm not about to leave them my life's savings, you know? Another thing that really tipped people off is that this woman had passed away shortly after a home visit from Harold, despite her being fine before his arrival. They ended up exhuming the body and found that she'd actually passed away from a morphine overdose, and the timing of that overlapped with the time that Harold had been in the home. After further investigation, it was realized that Harold also encouraged all of the families of those who had passed away to cremate the bodies, which is exactly why he needed all of those certificates, as well as the fact that he jumped through hoops to assure them that the cause of death he wrote down was the true and real cause. Imagine, you're like, I would assume so. Thankfully, he wasn't cleared of suspicions and was caught for his terrible crimes. He was tried and convicted of 15 counts of his crimes, but after his conviction, an audit estimated his number of victims to be around 236. In our number 9 spot today, we have Richard Ramirez. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of Los Angeles in the 1980s. He was known for his MO of invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the walk-in killer, but he had another signature that was concerning to many people, especially during the height of the Satanic Panic. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of a crime, authorities became worried that he was a Charles Manson copycat, but instead he was just his very own kind of monster. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind, while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, quote, "Hail Satan." In our number 8 spot today, we have H.H. Holmes. H.H. is often referred to as America's first serial killer, which just seems like a title no one should ever want to hold. While he confessed to 27 of his crimes, there are some who believe the actual number might be closer to 200, which is absolutely insane. You might be wondering how he was able to accomplish this horrifying amount of crimes, and that is due to his building of a hotel in Chicago. This hotel was designed to be like a maze full of windowless rooms which were intended to make escaping almost impossible, which honestly is just a terrifying thought. H.H. was the only person who knew the entire layout of the hotel, which he purposefully ensured by hiring and firing multiple different builders throughout the construction of the hotel. The hotel consisted of things like secret passages and trapdoors, soundproof rooms, doors that locked from the outside with gas jets on the inside. There was also a safe big enough for a human to be put inside of, which unfortunately he did, and there was also a very large chute which he used to get bodies from the upper floors to the basement, where there were 2 huge furnaces, a kiln, as well as a ton of acid. Not only would he get close to women to take control of their finances and then kill them, but he would also require his employees to take out life insurance policies that named him as the beneficiary. Again, a big red flag. Some of the bodies he even ended up selling to medical schools. Eventually he was found out, caught, and sentenced to death. It isn't known exactly how many victims he had, but it's thought to be somewhere over 200. In our number 7 spot today, we have Luis Garavito. Luis gained a nickname from the media of, quote, the Beast, and I think that's a great indication of the nature of his atrocious crimes. He is said to be one of the worst serial killers in the entire world, and it is believed that his victim count is up in the 300s range. He confessed to 147 crimes, and he was found guilty on 139 of those counts, which put his sentence at 1,853 years, but here's the thing. This trial took place in Colombia, where he lives, and there is a law which puts the maximum sentence to 30 years. He was sentenced in 1999, meaning there's only a few years of his sentence left and there's a chance he could get out early for good behavior. According to Luis himself, he committed these crimes because he had made a deal with the devil, and he explained that satanic ritual was involved in all of his crimes. In our number 6 spot today, we have John Wayne Gacy. With a nickname like Killer Clown, it is abundantly clear why everyone would want to stay away from this actual monster. He got his start in this horrifying nickname by being a clown for children's birthday parties, charitable events, and that sort of thing. According to Gacy himself, all of his crimes were committed inside of his ranch house, where he would lure his victims into. He would then trick them into wearing handcuffs under the pretense that he was going to show off some sort of magic trick, and from here, the horror unfortunately ensued. It is thought that he took the lives of somewhere around 33 young men, most of which he buried in the crawl space of his home. On the evening of December 11th, 1978, Gacy took the life of his last victim, Robert Peist. Gacy lured the young man in when he went into the pharmacy that he worked at, and while talking with the store owner, loudly declared so that Robert could hear that he often hired teenagers for his firm at a starting rate of $5 per hour, which was double what Robert was getting at the pharmacy. In hopes of getting a new good job, Robert ended up inquiring further after his shift at the pharmacy was over. When Robert's mother filed a missing persons report, the pharmacy owner was able to explain that Gacy was likely the person he went to speak to about the job, and when the police looked into Gacy's background, all the pieces were there just waiting to be put together. Subsequent investigation, questioning, and searches led police to gather all of the evidence they needed to arrest and charge him, and his conviction for 33 killings was, at the time, the most by one individual in the United States legal history. He was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980, and on May 10, 1994, he was executed by lethal injection, and I'm not gonna lie, I just think that's something we can all be grateful for. In our number 5 spot today, we have Albert Fish. Albert is one of the oldest people on this list, but that does not mean his crimes were any less horrific than anyone else's. Dubbed the Brooklyn Vampire or the Moon Maniac or even the Boogeyman himself, it is clear that Albert was a terrible human who did terrible things. In the early 1900s, Albert was arrested, tried, and convicted for killing and eating 3 people, but the horror was not over here. No, Albert began to claim that although people knew about the 3, the number was closer to 100, and he even claimed that he had some in every state. That's disgusting. To make matters even worse, as if it wasn't already terrible enough, this deranged lunatic also sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims. He detailed everything about how he lured her and the rest of the horrific things that occurred afterwards, like how he proceeded to eat her over the course of 9 days. Yeah. This is another person that I am not sad at all that they don't exist anymore. That's perfectly fine by me. In our number 4 spot today, we have Sam Little. Sam Little is well known for being one of the worst serial killers ever. He has confessed to taking the lives of more than 90 people, and while authorities have only been able to definitively connect him to 30, they say they have no reason to doubt the validity of any of his other confessions. Sam was able to continue on his horrible path for so many years because of the fact that he committed these crimes in different states and different counties, which made it more difficult to connect his crimes to one another. In an interview with an investigator named Sergeant LeBlanc, as they discussed religious beliefs, they spoke about the nature of sin. Sam stated he had no fear of God and said that God made him this way, so why should he ask for forgiveness? He said that God knew everything he did. He also allegedly told a few select people that he believed he was the devil. In our number 3 spot today, we have the alphabet. There are a lot of scary people on this list today, but some of the scariest out there are the ones we know have committed horrific crimes, but have yet to be identified. Yes, we are talking cold cases, unsolved crimes right now, and we are talking one of the worst. The alphabet killings are a series of unsolved crimes, named because of how each victim had their first initial match their last. So like their first name and their last name started with the same letter. They know these crimes are linked, or at least they have reason to suspect they are because of the similar MO that includes how the life was taken and where the remains were placed afterwards. They were all taken in a similar area around the same time. There are theories and suspects as to who could have committed these horrific crimes, but as of right now, no one knows for sure. These crimes were committed between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York, and because of the timing, it's possible that whoever committed these crimes could still be alive, or perhaps they're not. Authorities, despite having an immensely difficult job placed in front of them, are still committed and trying to solve this case to this day. In our number 2 spot today, we have Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez had a very difficult life growing up, and unfortunately this led to him living a life committing a plethora of horrifying crimes throughout South America during the 1970s. 1960s. By the time the 1980s rolled around, as he made a mistake during one of his awful crimes, this led to his arrest. Once in police custody, he spilled everything on basically his entire life and confessed to an insane amount of crimes. Like, we're talking confessing to 240 killings on top of the 110 they already suspected him of. Police were a little skeptical of just how many crimes he said he committed, but Pedro was able to lead them to a mass grave where he recovered a total of 53 people's remains. Pedro of course went to jail, but get this, he was somehow released in 1994, which is absolutely insane. He was then sent to some sort of mental institution for 3 years, but then he was also released from there for, quote, good behavior. Okay, so aside from the crimes he committed and the fact that they let him go, are you ready for the worst part? Well, in 2002, he was suspected of being the perpetrator of a new crime, but no one has been able to find him since 1998. Yep, Pedro just disappeared. Great. In our number 1 spot today we have Jeffrey Dahmer. This is one man who is exceptionally terrifying because of his actions, but he was also very, very smart, which adds an extra layer of terror to this one. Dahmer, who became known as the Milwaukee Monster, is one of the most prolific serial killers ever, and considering everyone we've talked about today, we know that's not an easy title to get. He became fixated with animals at a young age, and if you're interested in true crime and criminology, you know what happens next and how bad of a sign it is. Dahmer dropped out of business school due to alcohol abuse after just 3 months and enlisted in the US Army to train as a medical specialist, but that didn't last long either, as he was discharged after he attacked 2 fellow soldiers. After this, Dahmer fell hard into alcoholism, and this is when his killing spree started. Just to be clear, those 2 things are not related. I know you know that, but I just don't want anyone to think otherwise. Between 1971 and 1991, Dahmer went on to take the lives of 17 people, and some of the things that came after included the permanent preservation of the body parts, typically all or part of the skeleton. So yeah, things were very, very dark. One of his victims was able to escape and booked it to the police, which is of course what led to Dahmer being caught for his atrocious crimes. When they got there, the chief medical examiner remarked that it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. That is just how bad it was. In the end, Dahmer was tried and convicted and sentenced to 15 life imprisonments, and in February of 1992 he received an additional life sentence for a crime he hadn't yet been tried for that occurred in Ohio. In a very interesting turn of events, Dahmer was killed behind bars by another inmate in 1994.
First up in our number 10 spot, Dan Cooper. Back in 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper hijacked a commercial plane, and no one has ever been able to find him since. According to those involved, shortly after takeoff he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a bomb in his briefcase. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of like $1.2 million nowadays. Otherwise, he was going to everyone on the plane. After the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper released the 36 passengers once authorities provided him with the money and the parachutes, but he kept both pilots, 1 flight attendant, and 1 flight engineer as hostages on the plane. From there, he forced them to fly to Mexico City, but somewhere over Nevada, Cooper jumped off the plane with the stolen cash. The FBI launched a massive search that is still considered one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in FBI history, but have yet to find him. And although he isn't on the top 10 list anymore, he is still considered a wanted fugitive. Before we dive into the next 9 points in today's video, I just want to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Man, oh man, is this game blowing up everywhere, and for good reason too. It's quite literally the first phone game that delivers the same high quality experience you get on a console, plus it's completely free. Raid has endless content so you'll never get bored. With over 650 unique champions to collect, it's hard to narrow it down to my faves, but I'm gonna try for you today. First up, I picked Tuhawk the Wanderer. This beast is a void affinity epic from the Orc faction, and not only can he hit hard, but he attacks enemies 2 times and can also decrease the speed of your enemies. So what's new this month? Well, speaking of champions, Raid is running an extra special legendary champion based off of MMA and Pro Legend, Ronda Rousey, that you can get for free whether you are a new or longtime player. All you have to do is log into Raid and play for 7 days between now and February 20th, and Ronda will be all yours. To celebrate Ronda's arrival, you can also use this special promo code RAIDRONDA to get a bunch of helpful stuff like a 3-day 100% XP boost, 500,000 silver, and even 5 full energy refills. I mean, the perks just keep coming. But wait, there's more! As it is this season after all, Raid has prepared an extra special 12 days of Raid for new players this Christmas. Just download Raid Shadow Legend from the link below and head over to 12daysofraid.plarium.com between now and January 10th to get started. From there, you'll enter your player ID and set out on a festive 12-day adventure where each day you'll get to experience a new chapter and play a new mini-game for a chance to win amazing in-game and real-life prizes like holiday-themed Raid championships and even Amazon gift cards worth up to $1,000. And existing Raid players, I know what you're thinking. Where are your prizes? But don't you worry, I've got you covered. Just head over to 12daysofraid.plarium.com and you can find a special holiday promo code that everyone can use for a festive gift. If you haven't started playing Raid yet, what are you waiting for? You can click the link in the description below or scan my QR code here on the screen to get unique bonuses worth $30. We're talking a free epic champion Ana, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, and 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in the game. And all this treasure will be waiting for you right here. Coming in at number 9, Route 29 Stalker. One cursed area in the state of Virginia, known as Route 29, has unfortunately become notorious due to the number of women who have seemingly vanished there. The first victim of Larry Breeden, or at least that was his alias, was a woman named Alicia Reynolds. She had been seen driving down Route 29 to go shopping with her mother in a nearby town, but never arrived at the mall. Shortly after, another 20 or so women came forward to tell the cops that a creep had tried approaching them, trying to get them to pull over their cars on the country road, attempting to convince them that something was wrong with their cars and that he wanted to help. Shortly after, 3 more women were found dead on the road. Then after a strange 13-year gap in crimes, another 5 women disappeared between 2009 and 2014. To this day, the case of the Route 29 stalker has never been solved, and while there have been a few suspects over the years, no one has been convicted for the crimes. Whoever hurt these women walks free, and authorities are still on the hunt for the perp. Next up at number 8, Bhadresh Kumar Patel. Wanted by the FBI since 2015, Patel could be hiding anywhere. His arrest came, as I said, back in 2015 when he was charged for taking his wife's life. Allegedly, the perp struck her multiple times with a kitchen utensil while the two were working at a donut shop, and then cameras caught him fleeing the scene after the incident. His charges are currently first and second degree assault and a dangerous weapon with intent to injure. The FBI has reason to believe he's fled the country, as apparently his visa expired right before he killed his wife, and there is currently a $100,000 price on his head for anyone with information to his whereabouts. Let's just hope they find him soon. Coming in at number 7, Arnaldo Jimenez. Most people have a romantic honeymoon. At least that's sort of the assumption. But Mr. Arnaldo Jimenez here seemed to have a different plan in mind. Back in 2012, the day after marrying his wife, who, to make matters worse, he already had a family with, Jimenez took her out with some friends to a club. Apparently the couple left around 4 a.m. from the club, and from there, for whatever reason, Jimenez took her life. His wife was stabbed to death in the back of his car before being dragged into the bathroom tub of her apartment and abandoned. Obviously, this creep was charged and a warrant went out for his arrest, and although authorities have reason to believe he may have fled back to Mexico, they haven't actually been able to track him down. To this day, he remains on the FBI's most wanted with a $100,000 reward for his capture. Next up at number 6, Ruja Ignatova. Maybe it's just me, but a lot of the time when you hear con artists, you tend to think like a slimy person preying on the old and vulnerable through some weird email contest or something. But Ignatova had a different kind of clientele base she was looking to rip off: investors. Currently wanted for participation in a large-scale fraud scheme that involved her defrauding billions of dollars from investors all over the world, Ignatova began her Ponzi scheme back in 2014. It all started with her MLM called Bitcoin, but from there she moved on to bigger names with deeper pockets. In 2014, she founded OneCoin Limited, which was a Bulgaria-based company that marketed cryptocurrency. But behind the scenes, she was making false statements about the company in order to solicit investments. Later in 2019, her brother came forward admitting it was a money laundering front, but by then, Ignatova had already disappeared. Allegedly, during its active years, OneCoin is believed to have defrauded victims out of more than $4 billion. And not only is she on the FBI's most wanted, but she made her way onto the Interpol's most wanted and has a price on her head for anyone with more information. Coming in at number 5, Alejandro Castillo. Once again, another one of the FBI's most wanted. This criminal has been hiding out since 2016. 6 years ago, Castillo texted his co-worker Sandy Lee, who apparently he had briefly dated prior, saying that he wanted to repay her the money she had loaned him. So under the guise of getting her money back, Lee agreed to meet up with him. But here's where it gets twisty. Castillo had a new girlfriend at the time named Amia Feaster, and the afternoon of the incident, he was picked up by her and she drove the pair to the meetup. Although the full details of the crimes aren't confirmed, it's believed Castillo, instead of giving Lee her money back, held her at gunpoint while forcing her to withdraw all the money she had from a nearby ATM, which was about $1,000. Investigators think Castillo then drove Lee into the woods and took her life before dumping the body into a ravine. From there, Castillo and his current girlfriend Feaster fled in his Toyota Corolla to Mexico. Since then, he hasn't been seen, but his girlfriend turned herself in 2016, confirming they'd been living with Castillo's cousins when they were in hiding. The FBI hasn't been able to track him down just yet, but they do think he remains in Mexico to this day. Jose Rodolfo Villarreal Hernandez, also sometimes referred to as El Gato, this criminal is one of the newer additions to the FBI's most wanted list, having been just added 2 years ago in 2020. But he may be one of the scarier ones yet. A warrant for his arrest was issued back in June of 2018 when El Gato was accused of having involvement with interstate stalking as well as hiring 2 men to assassinate a man named Guerrero back in 2013. Allegedly, the 2 men hired to track down Guerrero and his wife attempted to shoot them down. Guerrero unfortunately did not make it past the attack, but luckily his wife escaped unharmed. The craziest part of all of this is that allegedly Guerrero's sister, after the attack, took revenge on El Gato by having one of his relatives beheaded, which to me sounds like they might have off the wrong people. Currently, the FBI is not sure exactly where El Gato is hiding, but the search continues, with $1 million being the price for anyone who's able to track him down. Next up at number 3, Eugene K. Palmer. Back in 2012, Eugene Palmer was the neighbor to his son and daughter-in-law John and Tammy Palmer. Now, not only was Eugene their neighbor, but he also owned the property that the couple and their family lived on. After some time together, John and Tammy's relationship started to go south, and after the pair separated and began seeing other people, Tammy issued a restraining order against her ex, John. On top of the restraining order, Tammy threatened divorce and to sue for the land belonging to Eugene, and all of this began quite the feud between the two. A few days later, Tammy and Eugene had a very heated argument, and then on September 24th, 2012, Eugene took her life. Allegedly, he shot her 3 times before fleeing the scene in his pickup truck, which was later found abandoned near a park. Now, Eugene was quite the woodsman, so it's believed he fled into the woods, and despite multiple searches, he has never been found. Coming in at number 2, Hazel Leota Head. Back in 1998, under the false name of Deanna Ray, Head conned her way into the heart of an old widower named James Barker. Now, according to the authorities, Head was a drifter who hitchhiked around the country looking for lonely men to latch onto so she could drain their bank accounts before abandoning them high and dry. Charles Barker was a depressed and lonely man after losing his wife, and when he met Deanna, he immediately fell smitten with the con artist. After only days of meeting each other, she moved in, and when his family met her, they had a strange suspicion that something about her wasn't right. After some time, Charles too began to think something with his new girlfriend was off, but he never shared any of the details with his family. Then one day, after not hearing from her father for nearly a week, his daughter called up her aunt, Charles' sister, asking if she could go check up on him and make sure that he was okay. When his sister arrived, she saw that the door was open and she ran inside to find Charles Barker dead, slumped over a bar. Once police arrived, they discovered he'd been dead for 5 days. And Hazel, or Deanna as she called herself, was missing along with Charles's car and money. The car was found later at an airport, and after running a background check, it was revealed she had pulled this same stunt 10 times before. She remains missing, but authorities have not stopped trying to track her down and arrest her for good. And last up in our number 1 spot, Michael James Pratt. Currently on the FBI's top 10 most wanted, there is no doubt in my mind that this monster is the worst on this list. Between approximately 2012 to 2019, Michael Pratt, along with a few accomplices, was involved in recruiting girls to be a part of an adult film production company that he owned and operated. Pratt lured the girls under a Craigslist ad asking for models, and from there he promised payment in exchange for a clothed modeling gig. But sadly, this couldn't have been further from what he had planned for the victims. Beyond the obviously morally despicable stuff they were making these minors do, he would also force past victims into providing false assurance to the girls that their films would never end up online. Allegedly, some of the victims were not permitted to leave shooting locations until the shoot was complete. Others were forced to perform after declining participation, and the crew was known to commit SA when the girls wouldn't comply. After fleeing the country in 2019, right before his trial for his crimes, he was added to the FBI list, and the search for this creep continues.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Scott Erskine. We are starting off this list with truly one of the worst people I've ever heard about. Scott's story starts off when he was a child and suffered an injury that involved his head and brain. He seemed to recover fine physically, but continued to complain of headaches and that sort of thing, and it is unclear if these things were ever looked into further. At a very young age, he began to commit violent crimes against others that I truly cannot even speak about here on YouTube. He spent 4 years in prison for one of his crimes when he was around 17 years old, but when he was paroled after the 4 years, he immediately began committing crimes again. In 1993, Scott invited a woman who was waiting for the bus into his home and ended up holding her hostage for several days. After letting her go, he was quickly arrested and ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison. This is when he had to submit DNA to a database, and in March of 2001, the DNA was matched when the cold cases of the unsolved murders of Jonathan Sellers and Charlie Keever were reopened. In 2004, a jury sentenced him to death, and 6 days later he was transferred to San Quentin. In an interesting turn of events, Scott did die on death row, but it wasn't due to a scheduled execution. Scott died a couple years ago in July of 2020 after contracting COVID-19. In our number 9 spot today, we have Dennis BTK Rader. The BTK killer, whose real name is Dennis Rader, was one of the worst serial killers from 1974 to 1991. He left taunting letters to police and newspapers where he described his crimes, but thankfully his annoyingly large and misplaced ego is what led to his demise. Because he craved the attention so badly, in 2004 he started communicating with the media again to try and be all smug or whatever, but this, combined with his utter lack of knowledge on how technology works, led to him being arrested in 2005. Imagine getting away with those crimes for so long and your ego and your own ignorance does you in the end. During his trial, he didn't apologize for his crimes, but he did describe them in full detail, which is horrifying and honestly very unnerving. After his trial, he ended up being sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. When Rader was first arrested and police were taking him to the station, an officer asked him, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" To which he replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." Ew. In our number 8 spot today, we have Chester Turner. Chester is an American serial killer who, on April 30th, 2007, was convicted of taking the lives of 11 women in the Los Angeles area, and on June 19th, 2014, he was convicted of 4 more that they were able to tie back to him. He has been referred to by prosecutors as one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, and if you know Los Angeles's history with things like that is not something to take lightly. In his original trial that led to conviction, Chester was sentenced to death, but at the following one in 2014, he also received an additional death sentence. In the end, like with a lot of these kinds of stories, DNA came to save the day and help authorities find out who was committing these horrible, horrible crimes. In our number 7 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted of 49 crimes but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in other vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence, in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared the death sentence and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were, quote, easy to pick, and that he, quote, hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. I hate him. In our number 6 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles' story really starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester, and soon after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps, using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back towards Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and then he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree together. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 5 spot today, we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more killings came to light. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at the time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so let's hope that never ever happens. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer is one of the most well-known serial killers ever, and that is never a good thing. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50 and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and the victims, which is just on a whole other disgusting level. Through recent genetic testing, like those 23andMe things, the identity of the GSK was finally revealed after years and years of investigations. Basically, they uploaded a DNA profile that they were able to get from the crime scenes to the website GED Match. They were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents as a match. And then from there, the genealogist made a large family tree, and from there, they were then able to single out 2 main suspects. After covertly collecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them with the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James DeAngelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served, as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes that he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old and will definitely spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 3 spot today, we have Rodney Alaka. Rodney is a horrible monster who was convicted and sentenced to death for 5 killings that he committed in California from 1977 to 1979. He also received an additional 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 other killings in New York from 1971 to 1977. Rodney got away with his crimes for a while because he wasn't the top of the list of suspects, because he was said to be the, quote, charming photographer. Rodney is often referred to as the dating game killer because of his appearance on the show, which, with what we now know about him, is absolutely horrifying. What's even crazier is that he actually won the show he was on, but the episode's bachelorette refused to go on a date with him because she found him, quote, creepy. This is just a reminder to always trust your instincts. It isn't exactly known just how many victims Rodney had. It is potentially thought that it could be much higher than the number he was convicted for. In July of last year, Rodney passed away in prison at the age of 77. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Zodiac Killer. This one had to make it on this list today because while there are a plethora of terrifying people on this list, nothing is as terrifying as an uncaught serial killer, and the Zodiac is definitely the most prolific of them all. The Zodiac Killer took the lives of 5 people in the San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969. He was most known for targeting young couples or a lone male cab driver. Despite 2 people luckily and thankfully escaping his attempted evil doings, he has still never been caught. He was one of those losers who left notes and stuff for the police to find. I like that they think they're being all cool and clever and brave while they do that. Like, if you're so brave and almighty and unafraid, then show us your face. While no one has heard from the Zodiac since 1974, the case remains active in many different countries, and maybe one day we'll finally know who the real Zodiac is. In our number 1 spot today, we have Robert Hansen. Robert is often referred to as the Butcher Baker, and his story truly is horrific. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because, for over a decade, he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness where he would then stalk them like prey. I am just now realizing that there is definitely an episode of Criminal Minds about this guy. Sometimes the premise is just so dark that it sticks with you. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrific things, he was just a soft-spoken baker. One of my best friends has the nicest, most kind bakers for parents, and now I'm starting to feel a little suspicious. Might want to look into them, Robin. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling strip clubs at night looking for the next person to take. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Paulson, who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole.